Take two. For the second time in as many months, a robotic lander built by a US company is on its way to the moon. Its stock value is climbing as the publicly traded Intuitive Machines is hoping to bring Houston back to the moon for the first time since 1972. National security threat. Lawmakers on Capitol Hill warning that Russia may be developing capabilities that could violate a decades-old peace treaty in space.
We're taking this potential threat very, very seriously, and we are examining what the best next steps are and what our options might be.
How the White House is responding to Russia developing a new anti-satellite capability. And rockets galore. SpaceX launched its 300th Falcon 9 rocket to date on a Starlink mission. It comes as the company stacked its massive Starship rocket in Texas for testing ahead of its planned third flight. Joining us for insight and analysis are Gina Sunseri, longtime producer with ABC News, and Chris Davenport, the space reporter for The Washington Post. From the Spaceflight Now News Bureau at NASA's Kennedy Space Center, this is News from the Press Site.
And liftoff of Artemis 1. We rise together, back to the moon and beyond.
Copies. On board the International Space Station.
Liftoff. Go Falcon, go Dragon, go Crew 7.
This allows us to go faster and to have better technology.
When we start putting humans on that vehicle, the excitement is even going to amp up even more.
Thanks for taking the time to answer our questions.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to News from the Press Site, our weekly roundup of the week in space news. I'm Will Robinson-Smith, reporter for Spaceflight Now. Thank you so much for taking part of your day to join us for a look at another busy week on the space beat. And just a little bit of housekeeping as we get things rolling. I'm going to keep an eye on the YouTube live chat as we are live this afternoon, coming to you here at 4 o'clock Eastern Standard Time. So if you have any comments or questions about our topics or things coming up on the Space Beat, be sure to put that in the live chat. We've got our editor, Stephen Young, here at Spaceflight Now, as well as our photographer, Adam Bernstein, keeping an eye on that. And so they'll let me know if you guys have some things to say, as long as, of course, they're appropriate to be read on the show. We'd love to bring you into this ongoing live dialogue. And naturally, we do have a wonderful panel joining us this afternoon. So want to go ahead and bring them in, let you meet them here. Gina Sunseri, of course, is a mainstay at ABC News, has been since the late 90s. She's both an Edward R. Murrow and an Emmy Award-winning producer who actually was recently selected by the Rotary National Award Foundation for an achievement, or for an award in space achievement in the Space Communicator category. Gina, thanks for joining us.
It's a mouthful, isn't it?
Just a little bit. Appreciate you being here on the show. And Chris Davenport, another highly respected journalist here on the Space Beat. He's been with the Washington Post since 2000. Like Gina, also had some time wearing a producer hat and covered topics well beyond space in his time at the Washington Post. Also an Emmy Award winner, also won a Peabody Award, and the author of Space Barons. Chris, welcome to News from the Press Site.
Yeah, hey, thanks for having me. I'm excited.
And we've got a lot to talk about, so really appreciate the both of you being with us. And since both the Washington Post and ABC have been extensively covering our first topic, I figured we would start with this. We can go to video 2.
And his subsequent post on social media about a national security threat has prompted a lot of questions. While I am limited by how much I can share about the specific nature of the threat, I can confirm that it is related to an anti-satellite capability that Russia is developing. I want to be clear about a couple of things right off the bat. First, this is not an active capability that's been deployed. And though Russia's pursuit of this particular capability is troubling, There is no immediate threat to anyone's safety. We are not talking about a weapon that can be used to attack human beings or cause physical destruction here on Earth. That said, we've been closely monitoring this Russian activity, and we will continue to take it very seriously. President Biden has been kept fully informed and regularly informed by his national security team, including today. He has directed a series of initial actions, including additional briefings to congressional leaders, direct diplomatic engagement with Russia, with our allies and our partners as well, and with other countries around the world who have interests at stake.
That was White House spokesperson John Kirby during a briefing on Thursday. And as you heard, what he was describing was a capability being developed by Russia, though largely still very classified. Comes after a couple of years following Russia performing a destructive anti-satellite test against a defunct Soviet-era satellite that, of course, shattered it into several thousand pieces. And that event, while not nuclear, of course, had immediate ramifications on orbit, as we've reported, and so has ABC, the Washington Post, and others. So I want to bring the panel into the discussion here. Gina, let's start with you, since ABC News was, I believe, the first to report on Congressman Turner's statement and allusion to this. So I guess just starting at a top level, what's kind of your and your colleagues' assessment of this budding ASAT technology that Russia is reportedly developing?
I think anyone was surprised by the revelation. I mean, since the war in Ukraine started, we've seen several threats from Russia. The threat to leave Mark Vande Hei behind that time. The threat to undock the Russian part of the space station from the rest of the space station. They can't do that, but it has been long accepted that the next step in warfare is going to be in outer space.
Yeah, I mean, that's, certainly had some very boisterous and combative rhetoric coming from Roscosmos under its previous leader. Some of that's been tamped down a little bit, but obviously this is, a very noteworthy development. And Chris, turning to you, your colleagues have also been tracking the story closely at the Washington Post. And if we can bring up this article here from the Post, in it, it was described that, quote, the capability is a nuclear-armed, not nuclear-powered weapon, according to two U.S. officials familiar on the matter. So, Chris, turning to you, that distinction of nuclear power versus nuclear-armed, for those who may not be as familiar with those terms, especially when it comes to space capabilities, can you break that down and what it means, especially in this context?
Yeah, no, it's an incredibly important distinction, and I think actually ABC News was the first to report that we're talking about a potential warhead here and not a nuclear reactor in space, using the nuclear as a power source, which you could imagine it would be used, for electronic warfare or directed energy, which could be used more precisely to target satellites. But if it is actually a nuclear warhead, which is what the Post and others have reported, that's really significant. And according to all of the space experts that we talk to, really reckless, because it's just indiscriminate and can take out a whole host of satellites and spacecraft in orbit and is not precise in its targeting. One of the key things, though, that you saw in that clip that you played from John Kirby was it's not at this moment operational. And I think one of the big questions is, how far away is it from becoming operational? Is this something in the beginning development stages? Is it something that's getting close to being launched and to being used? Or is this something that's sort of an aspirational technology that they're trying to pursue? So that I don't think we know, but if it is in fact a nuclear warhead, that is really significant and could take out not just satellites used by the United States, by the commercial sector, Russia's own satellites, could affect the International Space Station, where obviously there are cosmonauts. And it could affect China's satellites as well, and of course their space station. So the ramifications really could be quite widespread.
Well, and Gina, to Chris's point, obviously the timing of how soon this can be executed as technology is still, relatively unknown as far as publicly. But given the timing of when this, news came out from Representative Turner, I wonder what you and your colleagues make of sort of the why now of, bringing this to the attention of the American people, sort of putting this out in the public. Do you think it's more connected to sort of, as some have speculated, uh, Russia's possible frustration with sort of where they are on the local or the global, space domain now, where they used to be a dominant superpower and they've been very much supplanted by China? Or do you think maybe it has something to do as what you were, referencing a few moments ago, the ongoing war in Ukraine and potentially more connected to sort of where things stand with that?
I think you summed it up, very, very well, Will. It is hard for us to guess what Russia's intentions are. It's well known that they don't have the funding that they would like for their programs. We've seen the back and forth on selling seats on the Soyuz and the trade-offs. Russians flying on Soyuz, cosmonauts flying on Soyuz, and we're still spending money to fly on their spacecraft. It's really hard to say. As you well know, channels with Russia are difficult at the best of times, and right now it's particularly problematic. The sources that we're talking to are trying to figure out where they're going with this, but it is really a challenge.
Yeah, and sort of a weird moment given that at the same time that we're hearing this news of this potential nuclear weapon on orbit, or that could come on orbit in the somewhat near future, we don't exactly know, that
Right.
they're still talking with, SpaceX and, NASA about doing a crew swap for a seat on the Crew 9 mission coming up later this year and beyond. And, when we were talking just last month in Houston with folks from NASA and Roscosmos about that ongoing dynamic, they were, saying that they're also looking at further communication and cooperation with Boeing Starliner spacecraft. So I guess, Chris, to you then, does it feel like a weird dichotomy that both can be happening at the same time, or does it just sort of feel like a continuation of what's kind of always been since the Cold War days when, there's been challenges on Earth, but continued cooperation when it actually comes to, working on orbit?
Right. Well, when it comes to civil space, I mean, it's always seemed to transcend politics. I mean, even at the height of the tensions with Russia's, invasion of Ukraine, that partnership on the ISS endured. Gina talked about Mark Vande Hei and his flight, and you saw the NASA astronauts and the Russian cosmonauts on the station embracing Houston Mission Control, working with their counterparts in Russia. So that's always been sort of walled off. And there were a lot of questions whether Russia's invasion of Ukraine would affect that relationship. Clearly, there were tensions, but it continues. As to your question about the timing of Congressman Turner's, statement, putting this out publicly, it does seem a little bit odd. But then again, Will, this is Washington, and there's always a political backdrop to everything that's going on. We know that Congress is debating a rather large aid bill for Ukraine that's very controversial. You saw almost immediately or shortly after Congressman Turner's statement that Jake Sullivan, the National Security Advisor, made a statement, and he was perplexed, to put it mildly. He was clearly really perturbed that this came out publicly at a time when he was saying, we were going to have this meeting. We're aware of it. We're working on it. This is classified. It's very sensitive. There's no reason to put it out publicly. So you have to wonder if there are some, political motivations here as well. Not that that would ever happen in Washington, but you do have to sort of wonder and put that into sort of the factor of the timing of everything.
Yeah, political motivations in an election year. That's such a baffling concept, Chris. I'm not sure where that came from.
Right.
But in the realm of timing, just to put a button on this, since it's still, an evolving story, of course, sort of in the same realm of perhaps just coincidence, but could sort of tie into this overall fabric of this story. Earlier this week, we also saw SpaceX launch 6 important missile tracking satellites for the MDA, as well as the Space Development Agency. So, Gina, to you, and then Chris will give you the final word on this one. Does it seem like the U.S. is taking the necessary steps as far as we know them to grapple with this issue, or is there just so much unknown that it's kind of hard to say at this point?
I think the U.S. Space Force, a lot of people sort of joked about that when the previous president formed the U.S. Space Force. I think they're a very important organization. And the steps that they're taking, what they're doing to keep track of what's going up and coming down as well, I think helps us. They're all tight-lipped about exactly what's going up, what they're launching, but the frequency with which they launch that they're using all launch providers, I think is incredible. I really don't have any more details beyond that.
And Chris will give you the final word before we move on here.
Yeah, I mean, the question I was been wondering, well, sort of two going forward. One, what could the U.S. government, specifically the Space Force, do to deter this, right? To keep this from happening? The United States is, very involved in an effort at the United Nations to have a moratorium on, destructive anti-satellite testing, right? So the idea of shooting a missile to take it out, I don't think the United States would do that. That would run contrary to everything they've done. I guess it's a matter of what the threat is. And, we talk about the offensive capabilities of Russia and China, but of course we have those as well. Not that, the Space Force or the Pentagon really talks about it, but all of these, sort of offensive capabilities the United States has. And let's not forget that actually the United States did detonate a nuclear weapon in space in 1962 that was, far, more powerful than the bomb that we dropped on Hiroshima. So there is a precedent for that. The other thing I wonder about is you're seeing a strong reaction in the United States, in large part because of Congressman Turner putting this out into the public domain, and nothing's going to get headlines like a Russian nuke in space. But quietly and diplomatically, I wonder what's going on with China behind the scenes, because you would think China could have some real leverage with Russia to say, now, hey, wait a minute. You set this thing off in space, and that could affect us as well. So I'm really curious to see what, if anything, we learn about that.
Yeah, that's a great point, Chris. I don't believe I've seen much commentary from China since this discussion has really begun on the national stage. So definitely looking forward to seeing if they do comment publicly, if they do, what those comments are, and what their posturing might be. Because, as we've discussed, they of course have their own taikonauts on orbit and, are very protective of their in-orbit space infrastructure as well.
Yeah.
Well, turning from military space to civil space and actually a moonbound mission, want to go to our next story here. If we can switch over to video 5, fellas in the back. I'm going to bring up this video here. This was the launch of Intuitive Machines' first robotic lander, the IM-1 mission. Taking a look at video from the 1:05 a.m. Eastern Standard Time liftoff of a Falcon 9 rocket as it soared from Historic Launch Complex 39A at NASA's Kennedy Space Center. Big milestone, not only for Intuitive Machines, but also just a little piece of history that this was the first moonbound mission heading off from this pad since Apollo 17 took off on the Saturn V rocket back in 1972. So bringing the panel back in here to discuss this, a lot to break apart with this mission. Before we get into sort of the weeds of IM-1, want to start with you, Gina, and then we'll go to Chris, of just sort of the historical importance of bringing moonbound missions back to, a pad that really is steeped in that history. What this moment says to you.
I think it's remarkable. The fact, one, I'm really impressed with all the private companies and the commercial companies that are stepping up and making things happen. It is, Chris, I'm a huge fan of your book, The Space Barons, but you've got these plucky little upstart companies, Astrobotics, Firefly, Intuitive Machines, they're making things happen, and they're getting there. We hope they're getting there. Peregrine, to me, was a huge disappointment, but I was impressed at how open Astrobotics was in talking to us about what was happening, when it was happening, and what went wrong and why it went wrong. The Japanese, we all know how hard it is to get to the moon. I know I'm digressing here, but there's so much at play with this trip, with IM-1's trip to the moon. The launch is just the start. We'll see what happens next Thursday. Can they land on the moon? And what makes landing on the moon so hard? I just find this all fascinating.
Yeah, Chris, I mean, unfortunately, Astrobotic did meet an unfortunate end where it wasn't able to make a moon landing attempt. But to Gina's point, I mean, sort of following in the footsteps of Astrobotic, I mean, we've seen a fair amount of transparency so far from Intuitive Machines on this journey that's, about a day and a half or so into its mission. I guess sort of top level thoughts on the launch before we, really dig into the details of the mission.
Yeah, so to your point earlier, here it is taking off from 39A. I mean, if there's any real sacrosanct real estate, in the space industry, this is it. All of the Apollo missions, Apollo 11, Apollo 17, the space shuttle missions. Now it's turned over to SpaceX. You have a commercially developed rocket, in partnership with NASA, the Falcon 9, launching a commercial vehicle to go to space, right? And I think that shows the evolution of where we are now, right? This is not the Saturn V taking off. It's not the space shuttle. It's a commercial venture from this historic pattern. So I think that in and of itself is really interesting. The question then becomes, and particularly as journalists that we want to know is, okay, it's a private venture, right? There is taxpayer money going into this, but how transparent are they going to be? What are they going to tell us if there's a problem, if there's a setback? NASA has a duty to be transparent. Sometimes we push them because we feel like they're not being, but it's part of their DNA to tell the public what it's doing and what's going on. And we're seeing, at least now, a precedent being set, cross our fingers, with Astrobotic and now Intuitive Machines, that they're being fairly transparent about what's going right and what's going wrong. So I think all of us will just, keep our fingers crossed that continues.
Yeah, cross our fingers, certainly. And, one of the things that obviously is an important distinction between Astrobotic's venture to the moon and Intuitive Machines is that the latter is a publicly traded company, right? It's traded on the NASDAQ, and, you've got a lot of investors that are closely watching this. And, we've taken a look at sort of where it finished at the close of the week. Not sure if we have that graphic ready, but it looks like, it started at a little bit of a dip midweek because they were supposed to launch initially Wednesday morning. Here we go. You can see that chart right there. But at the close of trading today, on a slight bit of a downward trajectory, but overall, moving in the right path that Intuitive Machines wants to see. And so, bringing you guys back into the conversation, Gina, we'll start with you. From a business case, obviously Astrobotic wanted to see success with theirs as a commercial company as well. But given that Intuitive Machines is on the NASDAQ, how much more important do you think this may be that they do succeed and that they can prove success to their investors?
I think it's very important because NASA is just one of the payloads on this spacecraft. The others are all private companies, universities, research. And so if they're going to open up the moon for commercial exploration, they need to give those companies a guaranteed pathway from Earth to the moon. And so that's why I think this is particularly important. This isn't just getting Star Trek ashes up there. This is getting real commercial payloads up there. And, is this the economic way to do this? Is there a financial benefit for companies who want to go to the moon and see what's there and what the resources are? I'm trying to remember. I think it was Bigelow that once a few years ago proposed that we claim mining rights on the moon. And I believe there's a United Nations treaty which says, we can't really own the moon, but people certainly want to do business on the moon, which is what these commercial providers are helping us accomplish.
Yeah, and a lot of them are very eagerly looking at the next missions. I mean, we kind of alluded to that earlier with Firefly and future missions from Intuitive Machines. They've got a lot of folks lining up, not the least of which, as you mentioned, Gina, is NASA, which wants to get as much of its science in a robotic sense on the moon as possible. And Chris, want to bring you into this part of the conversation since, as we've heard from NASA leadership in the run-up to this mission and Peregrine, that they're considering these as quote unquote shots on goal, right? To use that sports analogy that they like to lean back on, that these are high risk, high reward type programs, and that they're more comfortable with them not succeeding if they don't succeed, as we saw with Peregrine 1. I guess what's kind of your assessment of that thought process, having, followed the NASA story and space program for a while? And do you feel like that they'll see their return on investment sooner rather than later, or as some have speculated that this is kind of a larger gamble than maybe worth taking?
Yeah, the whole idea of taking shots on goal and being okay with failure and having more sort of permissive risk posture is fascinating. It's to me a very significant paradigm shift for NASA. Going back to this, failure is not an option. I think it shows the evolution of the space agency. There's a lot of talk about what NASA has taught the commercial industry, and I think the commercial industry has also taught NASA some things as well. And that's, just try, go for it, fail fast, pick up, try again. And to see, NASA leaders at fairly high levels talking about that publicly is interesting. As to the whole, commercial economy, I think that's really interesting as well, and would be very curious to see how this, pans out. And if there really is a cislunar economy that can blossom, and this is the first step in that direction, I'm very curious to see how that pans out, what it looks like, what NASA's role is, and the government's role. I still think we're a long way away from a self-sustaining economy without having NASA and the government and the Pentagon being sort of anchor tenants and really keeping this afloat. But we're already starting to see some cool things. Like for IM, one of the things I'm excited about, I guess it's technically maybe a commercial payload, but the camera that's going to be ejected that was developed by the students and faculty at Embry-Riddle University that will eject, I guess, about 100 feet out and then take a series of images of the lander descending to the surface, and then they'll be able to stitch that together and create, a really, I'm hoping, a high definition, high fidelity image of that. That would be, really cool to have. And that, you could see that helping to, create more interest and generate more enthusiasm, having those kinds of images and spurring this sort of nascent economy, if that's what you want to call it, to some sort of, level of progress.
Yeah, I know it's definitely exciting to see, especially, young people have the opportunity to send their own crafts to the moon, as we saw with the Iris rover that unfortunately didn't quite make it, but they did get to spin their wheels on the Peregrine lander, and hopefully Eagle Cam makes and is able to send back that video. Gina, you're obviously in Houston and have the opportunity to talk with some of these companies as well. How are they feeling about the transition, as Chris was talking about, eventually from not needing to rely as much on NASA as that anchor tenant and, be that sort of cargo transit? Are they feeling like this is a good and important stepping stone, the CLIPS program?
Definitely. A lot of the smaller companies who would like to get involved in this kind of exploration don't have the resources or the funding. But when you're part of something like Intuitive Machines, that makes it possible. I want to bring up something I didn't know if you were going to talk about, Will, but it was the partnership that Intuitive Machines has with the local community college. In that area, have they've got the college kids who helped build this spacecraft. And this is, I think, a very important partnership between Intuitive Machines and the local industry. It's also where they are down in that area. Ellington is the ship channel, the refineries. So many of those students were learning trades and crafts to work in the oil industry, but those trades and crafts helped build this spacecraft. And I think that's an important partnership as well.
Yeah, no, thank you for bringing that up, Gina. That, having that sort of local basis of an economy, physically around Intuitive Machines, clearly is an important part of, creating those engagement points. So it's not just sort of at the main nexus of space where you think of, around the Kennedy Space Center or around Vandenberg Space Force Space, but you've got these little, opportunities, even, we were just up in Sandusky, Ohio a few weeks ago to see the Dream Chaser spacecraft, and, seeing a lot of the local press there in the, northwestern Ohio area, really excited to see, this future cargo space plane, in their community that was going through this important testing. And obviously that trickles down to all the folks that are, able to watch it, take field trips to, Glenn and the Armstrong test facility, and, be able to see this for themselves. So, thank you for making sure we touched on that. And moving on, just as a, sort of a marker of where we are in the mission, it is currently about 4:31 here on the East Coast as we're recording this live. For those who are watching it in a replay setting, we actually just got an update from Intuitive Machines about 40 or so minutes ago before we began live. And not to read the entire thing live on air, but just to synthesize some of the important pieces down, that they had some challenges in communicating with the spacecraft about 18 hours after payload separation. They were hoping to perform what's called a commissioning maneuver, or a burn of the main propulsion engine on the Nova C lander. And that would basically tell them that the lander is in good working order, that the propulsion system is operating as intended, and that they're ready to make their path to the moon in preparation for landing on the 22nd. Long story short, the burn hasn't happened yet. They still have time in their timeline before they need to get down to the lunar surface. But bringing the panel back in, Chris, will start with you and then going to Gina. We were talking about the importance of transparency on a mission like this. And, we don't exactly know a lot of the details as far as, when they might perform the burn, the timeline broken down from their previous update. But just what's your sense of the transparency that we've gotten so far? And, how important is it that, we, the public, and, as journalists, are able to translate the story out to, taxpayers, potential investors, of what's going on with these moonbound missions?
Yeah, I mean, always grateful for the update, and that was a good update that they put out today.
Yes.
They haven't, though, said what time they're going to land on the 22nd. They just said, the afternoon. Maybe that's because they don't know, and it depends on when the burn happens, and that could affect the trajectory and getting to their intended orbit. That's fine. But and you want to be careful about setting expectations, because then you're changing things. And then, journalists like us were somewhat persnickety and said, oh, you said it was going to be at 5 o'clock and now it's at 4:30, and what happened? So I understand that, but I still think in this case, we could see maybe a little bit more transparency here. And the best way when you have something where where you don't know the answer is just to sort of explain it, and to be upfront about it. We are getting updates. They say at least once a day. I got to say, for all of that, and I don't want to jinx anything, I feel good about this one. I feel like they have a good chance. I mean, I went down to Houston. I spent some time, with Tim Crane and Steve Altimus and the team there, and you just come away thinking like, yeah, these guys are pros. They're, if anyone can do it, it's them. So, we'll see. Space is hard. Landing on the moon is hard, but I do feel, fingers crossed again, but I do feel like they have a pretty good shot.
I I covered the space shuttle program where they would hand out briefings every day. You knew what the astronauts were having for breakfast, lunch, and dinner. You knew what cargo was coming back. We knew that Sunny Williams cut off her ponytail and sent it to Lots of Love. And then we morphed into the SpaceX days, where they tell you as little as possible. And you're dealing with so many different entities. Even on a ULA launch, say with Boeing, you're going to be dealing with Boeing, you're going to be dealing with ULA, you're going to be dealing with NASA. So three different entities to go for information. I thought Astrobotics was remarkably forthcoming with what was going wrong with Peregrine. Intuitive Machines, we'll see. It's you've got to read between the tea leaves here. If we can't get good information, we have trouble getting our audience interested in this. I mean, once we give them the highlights, yeah, it's been 50 years. It was a historical launch pad. We're going someplace we haven't gone before. It's a plucky little company. It's a cool spacecraft. What's going on with the spacecraft and where's the information? And I look at their last update, I'm going, how do I interpret that for an audience that isn't really geeky? Will you have an advantage because your audience is very deeply geeky? Mine, not so much.
Well, having come from the local news world, I very much, understand and certainly appreciate having to translate stories like this to a broad audience that is not, clamoring for daily updates and, reading every single tweet from, every company and then all the comments and the subtweets. So, I think that's a valid and genuine point that the updates we've been getting are lovely, but, it's hard to parse when there aren't, particular timestamp elements, and we sort of have to gauge, well, it was supposed to happen here and it didn't, and now you're saying it'll happen at some point, that there's still time. Well, what does there still time mean? Is it a couple hours? Is it a day? And I think there could be certainly a lot of interest, given that, we've never seen a robotic commercial lander land on the moon successfully. But, to both your points, it's hard to make that story, digestible to someone that's not, in our kind of orbit when we don't have all the puzzle pieces.
I need them to send some cat video back. That would help. Cat video from space is a winner always.
Psyche had it right. It was on the ball with that one. I guess, lastly, before we, hop off of this one and move on, sort of sticking with this topic, what would the both of you kind of like to see that we're not seeing, as it pertains to this mission in particular, whether it's, more timely tweets or updates or, information within that they feel like really could be the important leap pad to telling this more complete story?
I think the timeline is a key one. When there are supposed to be certain events, did they hit them? Did they not? What are they? How long do they last? What are the windows? What time is it supposed to land? Kind of starting with that. And then we could all those sorts of things. And Gina's right, because even if you have a problem, I think Astrobotic in the end, like I think even though it had these problems, the American public and everybody was like rooting for them. It became this thing like, oh, actually they're going further than they thought they would. Yes, they have this leak, but they're continuing the journey and they're continuing to get data back. And yes, it was, a failure in the sense that it didn't land on the moon, but there was a lot to take away from it. And, I think the reason why people were rooting for it is because they were so transparent and open. And you sort of, John Thornton, the CEO of Astrobotic, I mean, in the end, you almost, you just felt like bad for the guy. I mean, you felt the sympathy for him, but also saw his determination too. So it just made things a lot more human in a way too, which I think is important, which is another thing you're maybe not going to get from NASA, but these commercial companies have an opportunity to do that and to tell that kind of a story.
And let me take it a little bit further on the commercial companies. I want to go back to OSIRIS-REx because that was a NASA mission, and I had a choice to either be with Lockheed Martin in Colorado or to be in Utah with NASA. Lockheed Martin, I got access, I had the video, we had the information in a timely fashion. If you were in Utah with NASA, you were stuck. NASA TV didn't go live until 10 a.m. Eastern, which is 3 hours after Good Morning America goes off the air. By making the choice to be with Lockheed Martin in Colorado, we were in their control room when they gave the go to jettison the capsule. And this was happening 15 minutes before we went on the air. Lockheed Martin gave us the access and the editorial information that I wasn't able to get from NASA. So the commercial companies have a stake in being transparent with us.
Yeah, I think, if for, no other reason that we've seen, in this age of social media, the power of, storytelling that can capture the imagination, goes a long way, whether it's, being able to bring you in the control room, like with Good Morning America and ABC News, or, to, what we're just talking about with Robotic, the sort of almost memeability of, these updates, and, people on social media talking about like, well, we had this leak, but we were able to, go to the sun, and, we're just going to keep trying. And, the sort of, ridiculousness of it, but it kept it in people's minds. And I think, there's certainly value to that. Well, speaking of value to things, want to move on to our next topic here. This, was a company that was hoping to make its return back to Earth a while ago. If we can go to graphic 3 here, guys. This is a screen grab from, or this is some video from Rocket Lab of the work that they did on Varda's Winnebago spacecraft, which finally just got approval from the Federal Aviation Administration to make its way back to Earth. It's the first time the FAA has actually granted what's called a Part 450 reentry license. And it's also the first time that the Department of Defense has cleared a commercial company to land back on its property down in Utah. Speaking of Utah. Yeah. So, Gina, starting with you, bringing folks back in, how important is it that we're, at this step where Varda, who launched with, I believe, SpaceX back in summer of last year, is finally able to bring on-orbit manufacturing and the work they've done back to Earth?
I think that's hugely important. I mean, one way that SpaceX revolutionized, launches is reusability and bringing things home, and bringing this home is a big deal.
Yeah, I mean, it's, something that obviously they've been wanting to do, and have been waiting and hoping that the FAA would finally clear them. And, Chris, you've got companies like Redwire Space that have, space within the International Space Station to do, some limited on-orbit manufacturing and bring some limited samples down, like the 3D printed meniscus for a knee that they had from a couple missions back. But do you think this kind of opens the doorway, in some small way, towards being able to manufacture at scale some of the things that maybe, are not the best to try to manufacture on Earth?
Yeah, and then this idea that you land on land and be able to access, the science or whatever it is, almost right away, I think is a significant thing. It's something that, Boeing talks about with its Starliner and Sierra Nevada, with Dream Chaser landing on the runway. I will admit somewhat that this isn't something I've followed as closely as perhaps I should. One of the questions that appeared to me was, and looking at this, was, why didn't they have the approval before they launched? I was,
yeah, good point.
I was just wondering, because they were supposed to bring it back in July, but now here we are, 6-7 months later. You would have thought maybe they would have done that. And I understand, you could see them launching, and there's the launch window, and SpaceX is saying, let's go. And I believe it. Anyway, that was one thing that was curious to me. But I do think the idea of landing on land, which we're, I think, going to see more of, obviously, with Starliner and Dream Chaser, is significant. Not, but obviously we saw that with shuttle. But these are different types of vehicles, and, doing it for commercial purposes does add another, layer to it all.
Yeah, and certainly, Dream Chaser with its massive, cargo capabilities and the ability to land not only at the launch and landing facility at Kennedy Space Center and at Vandenberg, but also at commercial airports, and certainly other countries. I mean, they were talking about, bringing the Dream Chaser to Japan and some other potential strategic partners and expanding beyond the United States. So, I think we're starting to see some of the overtures to this LEO economy that has been talked about for some time. Gina, I'll give you the final thought on this topic of just, this beginning to expand, what has been hoped for as, a more dynamic and diverse low Earth orbit economy. What you think that, we'll see next from manufacturers like Varda, like a Redwire, moving forward.
Can I hop back to something that you brought up is diversifying access to space? What
Please.
Axiom has done by by launching astronauts from Turkey, from Sweden, and elsewhere, they're diversifying access to space. Now, it still comes at a really hefty paycheck, so I don't think we're quite there yet. But I think if you're going to get people excited about space, you have to open up access to space so more people can experience it. For me, the defining moment in the Blue Origin flights was that moment when William Shatner came out of the capsule and was just so incredibly emotional about that. And I think he brought people along with him on the journey with his statement after that mission. And every astronaut I talk to, Chris, Will, you, they all come back with the wonder of what they've seen up there. But still, we're talking about 500-600 people who've had that opportunity. So the defining moment will be when it's opened up for people who make my kind of money, who can go, who don't have $55 million. Maybe that comes with the students at San Jacinto College because they can help build a spacecraft, or with Varda or all these other companies that saying, yeah, we can do this too. Maybe that brings the people who are working with them and expands the excitement about what's possible.
Will, real quick, one thing that I just want to note, I do think, because we were talking about the FAA and Part 450, and I know nothing gets ratings like talking about FAA regulation, but I do think it's worthy to note. I do believe the FAA is trying to keep up with the commercial space industry and licensing the launches that they're licensing. They take a lot of flack, particularly from the SpaceX fans who want them, to hurry up and issue the license for Starship. SpaceX came out publicly and said they're moving too slow. They are under-resourced. We know that, especially given the enormous growth of the industry. So I think it shows sort of that the tension that they're trying, but it's not always, smooth yet. And that's one of the points of tension and one of the sort of development hurdles that as we make this transition from government to public-private partnerships and the rise of commercial, that, we're seeing the FAA try to adopt, and Part 450, I think, is a big part of that.
Yeah, no, that's a great point, Chris. And I'm sure we'll hear a lot more about that during the FAA's annual commercial space conference, which I believe is coming up in about a week and a half or so. It's right around the corner. And, to your point, there's a lot of companies clamoring for commercial licenses. SpaceX maybe clanging their bell the loudest for Starship. So certainly something to watch there. And actually, that's a great way to pivot to our final topic, as unfortunately, we're coming up on an hour. I don't even know how the time flies this quickly every time we have conversations these weeks, but SpaceX crossing an important milestone for them, or a significant one, certainly. This past week, yesterday, marked the 300th flight of a Falcon 9 rocket carrying, what has become, I hate to say a routine payload, but certainly the payloads that we've seen fly most often, which is SpaceX Starlink spacecraft. And if we can bring up the video here, this is the liftoff from Vandenberg Space Force Base against, fortunately, a very clear blue sky there, which is not always the norm for those who have watched Vandenberg missions before. It can be socked in with fog. It was great to see the 300th launch against these conditions. But bringing Gina, you and Chris back in here on the conversation, this is becoming more routine, but both of you have covered the burgeoning of SpaceX and now the regularity of their launches. This is their 15th of the year. I wonder how you're both thinking about this particular milestone, hitting 300 with the Falcon 9 rocket. Given that they've already launched, a crew this year, that they've got a bunch of, cargo missions coming up, at least one more crew mission, potentially another with Axiom 4, maybe Polaris Dawn if they're going to be ready with their spacesuits. How are you thinking about sort of where SpaceX is at this moment?
I almost think this is a pivotal point for SpaceX because really they've made their Falcon launches routine and routinely safe. It's been a long time since we've had a SpaceX Falcon mishap. I think what everyone is looking forward to now is what can they do with Starship and when can they do it, and can they do it in time for Artemis?
Well, and Chris, is the author of the Space Barons book, quite familiar with the jockeying for, space supremacy on a launch front. Starship obviously is in the midst of trying to get ready for its third integrated flight test. And actually, guys, if we can bring up the live view from Starbase, if we have that ready, they were working towards potentially a wet dress rehearsal today. There's a live view from our friends at Lab Padre down at Starbase in Southern Texas. They had to scrub, waiting for a little bit more information on exactly why they weren't able to do that tanking test. But, given the importance of Starship on the SpaceX program, both to them and to NASA, does it seem like they're working, or that they're following the timeline that they need to, given when NASA is wanting to use it for the Artemis 3 mission and beyond? I mean, you don't want to rush something that involves humans, obviously. I think that's something we can all agree on. But, we've already seen one very public slip early this year of the Artemis 3 launch. Do you think we may see another, given sort of where Starship is?
Yeah, well, especially given the fact that it is yet to make orbit. I actually am optimistic that on this next flight, they will make orbit. But they're going to have to show not only can they make orbit, they've got to have to do all the refueling or the refilling, show that they can launch multiple Starships in succession in a short amount of time. They're going to have to do a demo on the moon. They're going to have to show that, they've got the life support system for humans. So there is a long way to go. Elon always pushes and puts out these optimistic timelines. But then again, we saw this image like yesterday or the day before of 3 Falcon 9s on 3 different launch pads and Starship on its launch pad. And I tweeted something like, I guess this is how you get to 144 launches in a year. And one of the SpaceX engineers responded, was like, actually, we're going for 148, which I didn't even realize. And I don't know if they'll make it, but it sort of shows, how hard they're pushing. And that just relentless drive. I mean, and Starship is, this is the primary focus, I think, of the company, and certainly for Elon. And a crewed landing by September 2026 is the latest date. We'll see. I'm less optimistic, I think, about that. It's not just the Starship, but also the spacesuits. A whole host of things have to come together. But we'll see. But they're clearly, trying to move fast and trying to make real progress. And they have already. I mean, the progress that they've made on Starship has been, pretty significant in the last year or so.
Yeah, as Jim Free, says whenever asked about Starship progress, obviously that, as Chrissy just mentioned, they're not the only long pole in the tent. That there's, the spacesuits from Axiom Space, the readiness of Orion, and a whole host of other things.
Gateway, yes.
Yeah.
Yes. So many things that have to be in place first.
And Gina, given sort of, tying back to one of our earlier stories about intuitive machines, SpaceX had mentioned the synergy between the Starship team and the Falcon team in getting ready for that IM-1 launch. given that they had to load liquid methane on the lander that is, now trying to make its way to the moon. Chris mentioned that that Starship is, obviously a very important part of the SpaceX portfolio, but how important do you think it is that they continue to, not sort of silo the two separately, but, continue to share knowledge and learning and, help push forward, I guess, kind of rowing together in one direction, if you will?
I think it's very important. I think during one of the many teleconferences we did, we asked about what Intuitive Machines had learned from Astrobotics and their failures. And I know Japan was also very interested in what we had learned from what happened with Peregrine. And so I imagine it's the same with SpaceX. And I don't think they share information perhaps as well as some of the legendary space companies do with each other. But it is clear that we're building on Apollo, and what we learned from Apollo, no matter where you go, it's a capsule. We're back to a capsule, except for Dream Chaser. We're back to a capsule, and the physics, and it's the same. So, I mean, the sharing and just seeing where we're going next is, I think, going to be very, very interesting. I mean, I'd be curious to see what this show is next week, which would be a day after we land on the moon again.
We're very eager to see what that show looks like as well. Fingers crossed we have an actual moon landing to talk about and a successful return for Varda. And unfortunately we've already just about hit an hour. So before we go ahead and wrap up, want to close as we always do by giving you both the floor and, asking importantly, where can folks continue to follow your work? And B, what do you have your eye on in this upcoming week of, a lot of different space news items? Gina, we'll start with you and then we'll go to Chris.
Yeah. Chris, you want to go first?
No, please, after you.
Okay. The lunar landing. And I'm excited because Monday I'm talking to the students at San Jacinto Community College who built the lander and where they will be when they watch it. So I'm looking forward to that. Kind of looking forward to seeing what Firefly has going on. That's a couple of weeks from now, but definitely I think next week the news of the week is the lunar lander.
100%. It's whether they can do it. First American spacecraft on the moon since 1972, first commercial spacecraft. I will say you had mentioned the FAA Commercial Spaceflight Federation Conference. I actually am doing a fireside chat with Jared Isaacman and Michael Lopez Alegria. So I'm really excited about that. So those are two all-stars. MLA just got back from space. Jared's preparing to go, so I'm looking forward to that. And we'll see, what happened with this wet dress rehearsal with Starship and whether they're able to go in, early to mid-March for the third orbital launch attempt. I mean, that's going to be something.
Absolutely. And definitely looking forward to watching and listening to that fireside chat. You've got some great guests joining you, Chris.
Yeah, it's going to be cool.
Well, unfortunately, that's just about all the time we have for today. So Gina Sunseri from ABC News, Chris Davenport of the Washington Post, really appreciate the both of you taking some time to chat with us this afternoon. Really appreciate it, guys.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for having us, Will.
Absolutely. Love to have you back at some point in the near future. And, that'll do it for this week on News from the Press site. Lots we covered. If you want to go back and, watch the episode again, maybe want to rehear something, we'll also have, of course, another live show next week. Our guests will be announced on Thursday. So look forward to that. Lots to cover. Hopefully a successful landing for Intuitive Machines, but unfortunately, none of us have a crystal ball, so we'll all just have to wait and see and follow the good reporting of Chris and Gina and our colleagues, and of course us here at Spaceflight Now for the very latest on that. I want to thank the folks behind the scenes, the moderators in our live chat for keeping the conversation going there. Our editor here at Spaceflight Now, Stephen Young, photographer Adam Bernstein, for keeping things going on the technical side. For all of us here at Spaceflight Now, I'm Will Robinson Smith. Most importantly, be good to yourself, be good to others. and we will see you next time at Astra.